Welcome to What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, Code Pink's weekly YouTube program of hot news out of the region. In partnership with Friends of Latin America, Massachusetts Peace Action, and Task Force on the Americas, we broadcast every Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on Code Pink YouTube Live. Today, we are very pleased to be joining conversation with Todd Miller. He's the author of Empire of Borders and Build Bridges, Not Walls. Todd has been reporting from international border zones for over 25 years. I should also share that this episode was inspired by Leslie Salgado, who leads one of our broadcast partners, Friends of Latin America. So our program tonight and our guests are a huge thank you to Leslie. And so before I introduce our guests, let me tell you a little bit about both of his books. The most recent book he's written is Build Bridges, Not Walls. In this book, he and Todd invites readers to join him on a journey that begins with the most basic of questions. What happens to our collective humanity when the impulse to help one another is criticized or criminalized, criticized and criminalized being the key word. In the book, there's a series of encounters with climate refugees, members of indigenous communities, border authorities, modern-day abolitionists, scholars, visionaries, and the shape-shifting imagination of his 4-year-old son. These provoke a series of reflections on the ways in which nation-states create the problems that drive immigration and how the abolition of borders could make the world a more sustainable, habitable place for all. And then in his earlier book, Empire of Borders. The United States is outsourcing its border patrol abroad and essentially expanding its borders in the process. The 21st century has witnessed the rapid hardening of international borders. Security, surveillance, and militarization are widening the chasm between those who travel where they please and those whose movements are restricted. But that is only part of the story. As Todd reveals in Empire of Borders, the nature of US borders has changed. The boundaries have effectively expanded thousands of miles outside of US territory to encircle not simply American land, but Washington's interests. Resources, training, and agents from the United States infiltrate the Caribbean and Central America. They reach across the Canadian border, and they go even farther afield, enforcing the divisions between the global South and the global North. So everyone, we've got a huge evening ahead of us with a wonderful guest and to discuss 2 books and some really, really important big themes that we're all witnessing today. So welcome, Todd.
Thank you. It's my pleasure and honor to be here with you today.
Well, it's really, I'm so thankful you accepted the invitation, and I'm so thankful that Leslie put forward tonight's subject and was able to encourage you to join us. So thank you, Leslie. I want to, I guess, the best place for me to start and maybe have you talk is that, that both of these books, as I was reading them, really, there were some personal anecdotes that jumped, right into my mind. The one with Building Bridges, Not Walls, I just so immediately made me think of our Code Pink friend, Carlos Laszlo. He's Cuban-American, and he has a project called Puentes de Amor, in which he is uniting people of varying politics surrounding Cuba, particularly Cuban-Americans, in finding a way to get part, if not all, of the blockade lifted in Cuba. And so he's such a prime example of building bridges in an emotional sense. And it just that project, Cuba specific, just leaped into my mind when I was reading excerpts from your book. So maybe we should start there, since this is a current project that Code Pink is involved in, and it just meshes so nicely with what, with the theme of this book.
Yeah, sure. That's a great place to start. And it sounds like a really great project that you have going with Code Pink.
Well, it's Carlos's project, but we partner with him on a number of
a
different
good partnership, I should say.
Yes, very good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's so when you came to title this book and the theme, let's talk about where that came from. And because this is your son accompanied you in the encounters you had that come up in this book.
Yeah, I should say the book was inspired. It's in fact in a lot of ways the Empire of Borders book you just mentioned. I have 2 books before that as well, which are very much investigative journalism. And this Build Bridges Not Walls is also investigative journalism, but it's more of a meditation of, these 20 or so years of looking at border issues and working on the border. And it comes from a lot of really, these experiences that I've had reporting on it. And it starts, if you don't mind, I'll mention how the book starts.
Of course. We'd love to hear this.
Great. It starts with an encounter I had with a person. I was driving on the Tohono Nation, which is it's a native reservation that borders Mexico and southern Arizona. And I was about 15 miles north of the border and rumbling down a dirt road when a man appeared at the side of the road, and he was waving his arms in distress. So I pulled over and rolled down my window and started talking to him. And I should say, right before that, I was going up this mountain with a Tohono elder in the Babakivari Peak, for those who are familiar with the geography in Arizona. And you could see you could see even when we're 15 miles away into Mexico from this top of this mountain peak. And I remember thinking, wow, this is almost like what you would see with a borderless world, because you couldn't see the border. It was just the horizon.
Yeah, the border's a line on the map.
Yeah, it was a line on the map. You couldn't see that
too,
line. Yeah, it's a wall too. So you would actually see that on the ground, but at that level, you couldn't see it. So in that moment, when I stopped and I was talking to this man, and it turns out he was from Guatemala. He had been walking through the desert for a couple of days. He needed some water. I gave him a bottle of water. And then he asked me, I asked him, is there anything else I can do? And he said, can you give me a ride to the next town? And then I hesitated. And the reason I hesitated was I knew what was around me. I knew the border apparatus. I knew that for the Border Patrol, if you further someone's presence in the United States, it could be a felony. You could face years in prison. So I hesitated. I knew that from all this years of reporting, I knew that, the Border Patrol was around. They could be drones flying overhead. There could be a surveillance camera on me. There could be an implanted motion sensor that we tripped. But this hesitation turned into ire, or I just got really mad, because at the same time, here we are. This man I'm talking to is obviously in distress. I know what goes on in the desert. I know that people perish crossing through the borderlands. And all the values that I learned from a very young age was to help other people, right? Like in all the different, just intrinsic values you learn. And then here I am being told, thinking about the law, and I'm not supposed to help this guy. And so that was the seed of Build Bridges Not Walls. This is
the criminalization of helping someone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so what I did was I took that moment, and it turned into this book. But I took that moment and I took those questions I had from that moment, and which is also a meditation of all these years of reporting, but also bringing these questions to all kinds of people, from visionaries to philosophers, to migrants, to refugees, to even agents. And as you mentioned earlier, children, including my own children. And there's this one real great story. We were at the border wall in San Diego. I live in Tucson, so San Diego's maybe about 5 or 6 hours in car from here. And we were at the border wall right where it meets the sea. So people probably know where the ocean just comes crashing against the border wall. It extends deep.
Yeah, it goes right into the water.
Yeah.
It's really grotesque looking.
Yeah, it's very. And these surfers were out there. They were kind of purposely antagonizing the border patrol. They would go back and forth between the two countries. But anyhow, I was there with William, who at the time was 4 years old. And they yelled at William because he was going to run up to the wall and talk to people. So the border patrol yelled at him, told him he couldn't do it. And so we sat and talked about it.
So there's that lack of humanity, the humanity being taken right out of a little child.
Yeah. So he's baffled, right? Why can't I go talk to these people?
Sure.
And but this is I think what captures the spirit of this book was this conversation, because we talked about things, but then he looked at the wall, which is made of steel. It's made of metal, bollard bars. It's almost like looking at a prison. And he said, why can't we take an excavator, because he just learned that particular word, and crush the wall and then turn the wall into bikes? So there it was, right? The wall. Yeah, it's like that I think captured one of the profound spirit that was just manifested in many different ways throughout this particular book.
Doesn't that just for you in that moment, just a true life physical example of the things we learn as we become adults, the things that corrupt us. Because here's your son, like, well, let's just tear it down and build a bicycle. I mean, and
it's so practical, right?
Yes, and something that everyone could enjoy.
Right, like this, taking it from a symbol, or actually an act of oppression, into something that is an act of freedom, like something that impedes movement to the freedom of movement. And he saw it, and here I am, I'm not going to reveal my age here, but all these years, and it doesn't even occur to me that you could look at this wall and think of it as another thing altogether, that it could have another use.
Well, he hasn't been corrupted by the media and the paradigm that we live in the States. He's a child. It just really, it's such an example of things on so many levels, what we learn and how that, how we evolve given all the stuff that's, put on the hard drive. Yes, Leslie.
Yeah, I would just like to add something, that this brainwashing and training and dividing people is not only happening in the US, unfortunately. You go almost to any country in the world, and Todd talks about it in this book and also in Empire of the Borders, how we are breaking people up in order to have the ones who have everything, who have the right to go anywhere, to basically look out for their interests, as if the poor people are the ones who are taking things from us, without understanding that they are the ones who are helping us with everything. They are the workers. They are the ones who are out there as first responders. When this whole pandemic hit us, who was feeding us everywhere? I originally come from Ecuador, and my sister was telling me how the indigenous Ecuadorians, decided that in order to survive, they had to come out and sell their products. Yes, they were wearing masks when they could afford it, but they were the ones who were saving lives right here in the US. Who are the first responders? The people who are working in medical centers and stores, grocery stores, cleaning the streets. They are the ones. I love your book, Todd, and I have told you this before, because as a retired bridge engineer, I'd rather build bridges than walls, definitely. Thank you.
She does. All of you watching should know Leslie does. She's profoundly good at her Latin America solidarity work. She can talk with everyone, and we all admire you for that, Leslie. You're such a great example.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
But Todd brings it to the whole world, because what I love about the work that you do, Todd, is that, we work in certain regions only because we are close and we know a little bit more about those regions. But the same policies are being applied worldwide. What happens against Ecuadorians or Latin Americans is also happening about Iraqis, and it's happening against Syrians. It's a worldwide problem. And you make that connection. And so that's what I love about the work that you do, Todd.
Thank you.
Well, maybe
it's in Haiti.
Well,
Yeah.
I was to say, maybe we should continue with this theme that I have all these notes, Todd, for all these things that are just leaping into my mind as we talk. I do want to get to Haiti, though, as Leslie. The criminalization of helping people, I really, the thing that pops into my mind about that is the case of Dr. Scott Warren when he was trying to bring water to the desert. I think that was a terrible situation for him for trying to bring water to migrants. And then let's talk about Haiti and climate change and how climate change is driving migration. Governments are driving migration, and Leslie kind of touched on that. And of course, how corporate America and transnational corporations are actually profiting from this created migration.
Yeah.
I know that's a whole lot, but there's so much, and we have you for the hour. So.
Yeah, no, it's great. I could start with Haiti because Haiti, the whole situation in Del Rio that I'm sure a lot of people here were following in the on the U.S. Mexico border, and I always look at the coverage of the kind of cable news network coverage of it, and it just it's appalling, really, the way that it's often framed. But looking at this, if we to talk a little bit about empire borders, the border, about the extension of the U.S. border. This isn't the first time the Haitians have been, of course, at the U.S. border. The U.S. border actually goes right up to the Haitian shores. And one real vivid example of that was the 2010 earthquake that I think people will remember. More than 200,000 people were killed. More than 1 million people displaced in Haiti. And 5 days after that hurricane, the United States sent a jumbo jet over Haiti, people in the rubble of the devastation in their homes. And they heard the disembodied voice of the Haitian ambassador speaking in Creole, interpreting what the U.S. Embassy was saying, telling people not to leave. If they left the island, then they would be interdicted and returned. So what happened is then 16 Coast Guard cutters from the United States came right up to Haitian waters and were at the ready. So the border, this is the border, at the ready to interdict anyone who came. At the same time, Geo Group, which people know is a private prison industry, they opened up beds in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. So if they were to interdict them, they would have detention space for any of the Haitians leaving the island. This is all in 2010. This is just one example of how the border, excuse me, something caught in my throat. How the border is not it's not a static thing. It's elastic. It can expand. And in this case, it expanded right up to the Haitian shores. And one more thing I want to mention about this, because this is something I go into pretty deeply in Empire of Borders, is that also, that Haiti shares the island with the Dominican Republic, and the DR had been receiving tons of first pressure, then training, then resources by the United States to form its own border patrol. And so I was able to go and see that firsthand, the border between the Dominican Republic and Haiti in the town of Dajabon. And you could see like the formation of this border patrol, they were sitting their X's just like you would see U.S. Border Patrol agents sitting their X's on the U.S.-Mexico border. You could see the kind of blueprint of training that they were getting. So if somebody were to leave because of that earthquake, or later because of any of the reasons that, the kind of what Christian Parenti calls the catastrophic convergence. He's a sociologist. He wrote this book on climate change called The Tropic of Chaos. And what he calls a catastrophic convergence is when a number of different issues that are often siloed, right? Like your political, economic, social, and in his analysis, increasingly ecological issues. In his climate change is what he was specifically looking at. increase and converge together to create untenable situations, which often are displacement. So when you have that sort of catastrophic convergence, when you see in Haiti, right, with Haiti is there's a group called German Watch, and it determined that Haiti was the #1 country that had been hit with weather rate related events in the past 20 years, tied with Myanmar. So Haiti is one of those countries that's getting pretty nailed in multiple ways by the changing climate. So you have this climate emphasis, and if you look at who's when you think of the U.S. border, on the Dominican land border up to the shores, and then if you just go and Google, or you can go look at who has the historic emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, and the United States is responsible for 30% of the entire world if you go back to 1850. In Haiti, I think I have to remember, but it's 0.0 something like 7 per. So the point is a mere fraction of the emissions, and that's one of the elements that's behind this sort of displacement. Yet when people try to move, there's a U.S. border on all angles, and so when people arrive to the U.S.-Mexico border via, in a lot of cases, South America, via Chile, via Brazil, coming up these long journeys up through the Americas to get to that border. It's not like they came here out of nothing, right? It's not like it's often presented, oh, it's thin air, out of thin air. There's all of a sudden all these people at the U.S. border. One, no, there's a whole huge story, and the United States is very much involved in that story. And then two, the border, they are facing the U.S. border constantly. So this is just another manifestation of it.
Well, I always, we've talked on this program before that, the U.S. border basically, I'm talking to all of you from Mexico City tonight. The U.S. border goes right down through California, Texas, through Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, hops over Nicaragua, which I would argue is part of the aggression towards Nicaragua right now, and then continues on through Costa Rica, Panama, right down into Colombia, and perhaps now even Ecuador. And so, yeah, it is constantly expanding. And there are, there's U.S. representation in various forms of police and military right on those borders. I think so many people watching, I'm sure, have traveled to Canada. When you come back to the United States from Canada, you go through customs and immigration at the airport on the Canada side of the border, in the airport, in the Canadian. Mm-hmm. It's crazy.
Yeah, with a welcome to the United States sign.
Yes,
you're in
exactly.
Canada, and then you under, yeah.
In Canada. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about about Haiti, mainly because right now we're seeing so many people fleeing Haiti, natural disaster. They've had hit by the hurricanes, a coup led by the United States, assassination of a president. I mean, just on and on and on. It just doesn't end for those people. Many are fleeing across the Caribbean to the Colombian shores, and then taking a short boat trip, and they're very clandestine, like coyotes, smuggling people into the United States from Mexico. These little boat trips to Panama, and then coming up the Mesoamerican peninsula, as you described. They're not just coming from one place. It's a horrific journey that these people are taking, principally Haitian, and they are part of that population held in Del Rio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they're as they travel north through that whole area, as you just said, that's all of those places. Well, particularly Panama and Honduras. As you say, Nicaragua isn't in the equation necessarily, but Honduras, particularly in Guatemala, they've had just incredible amounts of resources put in by Customs and Border Protection. Example 300 of how the border is extending, putting just tons of money, trainings of police and immigration officials, forming border patrols and in these different places, and the whole apparatus, much like you see in the United States. So like, if you're coming up as a Haitian through these places, the U.S. border pretty much probably starts at the Panamanian coast, and then you're just facing it constantly everywhere you turn. I would really like to get some more information about how many people are getting arrested. And I know on the Mexican-Guatemala border, there's been quite a few. I know that the Mexico's really ramped it up and really have been targeting Haitians coming across. But that, and then again, it's like, I no longer, I consider it to be like just extensions. I mean, it's a collaboration, I guess, between the countries. So the countries are collaborating for sure. But it's like there's a lot of pressure from the United States and just tremendous amounts of resources and trainings and that are put into like building up these borders. And you look at the U.S. border policy and any of the strategy papers, and you see the word layered everywhere, layered. And that before I really went into this endeavor with Empire of Borders and looking at this, I would more be inclined to think, oh yeah, it's layered going into the United States, into the interior. Yeah. There's the Border Patrol works in 100-mile zones. ICE works in the interior. So it's like a border being the whole country. But now I know better that it's also very much rippling out into the world. And that is also part of this layered apparatus. And then Mexico has been, since 2015, has been arresting and deporting more Central Americans than the United States. So this is a shift. In this case, it's a shift of what the U.S. had been deporting more Central Americans. But in 2015, they had a Programa Frontera Sur, which was implemented in 2014, but also just this kind of bolstering of the border. And so a lot of people, asylum seekers, people coming north, get stuck at the Mexican-Guatemala border before they even come close to the U.S. border, which also keeps them out of the cameras of the media. Like, people don't even know this is happening, because I mean, if there's lacking a scarcity of coverage on the U.S. border, imagine how the lack of it on the Mexican-Guatemala.
Oh no, a lot of people have no idea how violent and aggressive the Mexico Guatemala border is. It's really, and it is extraordinarily controversial here in Mexico, especially since Mexico has such a history of welcoming immigrants throughout history, and non-interventionist, and a president who is, really pretty progressive, especially coming out of the CELAC summit in September. And yet here is this policy in collusion with the United States to hold people at the southern Mexico border with Guatemala. I would ask you, how much of that, has to do with climate change that is dramatically affecting the Northern Triangle countries, which, again, climate change does not get tied into a root cause of migration much in the United States, but we're looking at people coming from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, what we refer to as the Northern Triangle.
It definitely should be a lot more, and I can give you some statistics that show this. I remember when the book before Empire of Borders I wrote was Storming the Wall, and that was all about like connecting climate change and borders. And I did do some research right. I remember, like, in 2015, I was in Tenosique, right on 20 miles from the Guatemalan border, and talking to 3 Honduran farmers who were saying they're going north because there was no rain. There's no rain, no harvest. And
that dry corridor.
They're from the dry corridor, and the dry corridor area that extends from Guatemala, even southern Mexico, into Nicaragua, all the way to Nicaragua through Honduras, El Salvador. And that swath of territory is getting bigger, and the kind of unpredictability of the rains stronger, and the droughts are becoming more persistent. And 2018, this is like 3 years after I was there, the droughts were so bad that that by the end of it, the World Food Program came out with a report saying that 2.4 million people in the dry corridor area were suffering hunger. And even that year, Customs and Border Protection admitted that people from Guatemala were coming from these drought-stricken provinces or departamentos in Guatemala.
Mhm.
And then I want to add to this because that's already a dramatic number. But after 2020, and you have accumulation of more droughts, and then these two back-to-back hurricanes that hit Honduras and Nicaragua on the coast, and in November, nearly a year ago, back-to-back Category 4 hurricanes that were just that intensified, like we're seeing in the climate era, really rapidly in the warm Caribbean waters, and then carrying tons of precipitation. So the flooding in Guatemala was intense, like flooding so high that it just, like one town, they described it being underwater except for the church steeple. And so after 2020, combined, of course, with the pandemic and the COVID, everything with COVID, that number of 2.4 million people in hunger in these areas went up, and this is again according to the World Food Program, went up to 8 million people in just those couple of years. And they also they surveyed people how many people are considering migrating. In 2018, 8% said they were. Concrete plans. They use the word who has concrete plans to migrate. In 2018, it was 8%, and then in this last survey I was just mentioning, it happened in January of 2021, that went up to 15%. So there's all these ties that we're seeing to this displacement. I would argue again that it's in the kind of catastrophic convergence of many different issues coming together, and the ecological issues are exacerbating situations.
Yeah, Leslie.
I would like
to raise your hand.
Well, I just want to make sure that I don't cut you off, but a group of us went to Nicaragua last year in January, and we went there because we were concerned about the news that we were hearing about what the role of the government was, and these upheavals in April of 2018 and all of that. And what you just said, about what's happening in Honduras and Guatemala particularly, it's quite different in Nicaragua. Our experience was that, and so what I want you to tell us a little bit about what your feelings are about, what the role of governments that are there to protect the people, like I believe in this case, the governments of Honduras and Guatemala are not, and the floods and everything, there were these climate change issues, like it hits Cuba, it hits Puerto Rico. The difference between the number of people that are hurt, whose homes are destroyed, people who died, between Cuba and Puerto Rico, and also the difference between the people who died in Honduras versus Nicaragua is tremendous. It's huge. Because in Nicaragua and in Cuba, two countries that have been demonized by the United States, are doing the right thing. Can you tell us, what your thoughts are about
Puerto
that?
Rico still doesn't have electricity. We don't talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think my own research has been more looking at places that have been, like looking at the U.S. and the U.S. border and how that's meeting up, and how they're collaborating with governments. So it's hard for me to speak in depthly on this, but I have seen what you're talking about. I've seen they're the noticeable, like especially with Cuba, like there's I remember Hurricane Irma that was from 3 years ago, I think, and it just that was before Maria, right? That just nailed Puerto Rico, but it went right through Cuba. And I was just amazed, like and there was a bunch of articles about it and I read a couple of them about how Cuba was able to withstand this I think it was Category 5 hurricane way better than when it hit Key West or when it hit Florida a day or two later. And of course, like you didn't hear anything about Cuba compared to Puerto Rico. And that same time Maria hit maybe 3 weeks later, and the devastation, as Terry just mentioned, is still like I was just on the west coast of Puerto Rico maybe a year ago, and there's still just like you still see the devastation of the hurricanes. Not to say that, of course, in Cuba that could be the case too, that you'll see the just trees that have been knocked down and stuff like that. But those sort of statistical differences I think are very apparent. And I think you bring up these really good points that it does matter what governments are doing. And which goes to this other point, which is, why are these governments collaborating with the United States so much to then spend all these time and resources and energy in the case that I'm looking at in Empire Borders, of building up border patrols, when instead they could be focusing time and energy and on, maybe a force that helps people get through these situations that are like the disasters or droughts, or there could be goes to this world that if you look at climate, it's like, this is the existential problem. When you think of borders, you're supposed to think, there's a threat on the other side of the border and we should be scared of it. They're going to come take something, right? And that's I don't know if you can swear, but it's a bunch of BS.
But the same question, why are these countries spending so much money in war?
Yeah, exactly.
And policing, when instead of, spending in medicines, medical supplies, and cleaning the environment, protecting the environment and education of our children. Yes. That's the question.
Yes, that's exactly right. It just makes so much more sense if you're really concerned about well-being of people, even if you're concerned about like people not having to be displaced, right? Or if there's like the infrastructure and resources, if somebody has their community flooded, but there's resources to fall back on, there's a health system to fall back on, there's all these things that people can fall back on, then you're not in the desperate situation, and it creates a whole other different thing. There's a whole different element. But what I'm seeing, like you say, like the brunt of the money goes to the militarization of, and borders being one part of that, right? And it's just money that's so ill spent, and it could be just spent making a much better world than what we have before us.
Well, it's that, I don't know the word now, unless they want to say choke, that clash that we're seeing. Yeah. We've talked about this before, specific to Latin America and the Caribbean, this clash between these two paradigms, those governments and economic systems that are people over profit, or at least a healthier balance. And then you have this US neoliberal model that is profit, profit, profit. It's all about profit. And you see places like Puerto Rico, which have not been able to recover from the hurricane. Everything has been left to fall apart and is now being bought up cheap and privatized. The natural resources, the public infrastructure, public institutions, they've all been left destroyed and are being made into private enterprises, which is part of the problem that's wrong with the Puerto Rican electric grid. And we talked about this last week, for those of you who watched us, that, and my guess last week, the power went out right before she was supposed to join Zoom. And it came back. But it's privatized, and the public grid serviced the whole island. And now you have a private system that only services, a privileged part of the population. And also we see this with this privatized, this people over profit models. Leslie brought up the hurricanes in Honduras that hit, Guatemala too, as you said, Nicaragua and Honduras, November of last year. We did an episode specifically talking, this was after the first hurricane, and then 5 days later, the second one hit. But in between the two, we had a conversation with representatives from both countries, and there was no comparison as to how here this US propped up government in Honduras that has ample resources, not going to the people, but to the government, no response, hardly at all, for people on the Caribbean coast of Honduras. And Nicaragua had, rapid response with everything they could possibly, offer, including getting roofs back on houses within 10 days and the communication tower back up. And no comparison in the response. Right. But it's those two models that clash. And I'm sure that has something to do, with the police But also, you know, one of the things just in the synopsis of your book was how a certain demographic on the planet remains free to travel, and so many of us less and less and less every day. And that's who gets the access.
And that segment tends to be the wider one, the wider looking one, isn't it?
Global North, the people in the global North, which you talk about in your book too. And maybe we should touch on that disparity between the global North and the global South.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that I think is a super important, because when you talk about open borders or no borders, it's a very stigmatized subject, it seems to me. It's hard to mention, you know, and even in casual conversation, it seems to. But one of the things is like, what do people think of? They think of people coming to the U.S. border and people who have been dispossessed, really, you know, and it's never thought of that there is already an open borders policy, and there's an open border, like an open borders policy, right, for U.S. passport holders. In many ways, you can get
and for U.S. business interests.
That's my next point. The main thing I want to talk about it is that, right, you have the U.S. business, U.S. military as well, that can go wherever they please. They go over borders at 35,000 feet. They don't have to. Often, like, now there's so much extractive industry everywhere, just sucking the wealth out of everywhere, all these countries, leaving like water sources poisoned with cyanide if it's a mine. And yet, you know, when we talk about border patrols, it's always for the poor, right? When we talk about ICE coming in and rounding it up, we're not talking about them coming to round up a mine, or a mine put in Zacatecas or in San Marcos in Guatemala. They're not coming to deport and expel people for causing harm. It's always about people, you know, workers, poor workers, or the way that it's all like kind of framed is that there's, you know, we only think about it for one set of people, and there's another set of people that it's just, there are open borders, can go wherever they please, do whatever they want, take whatever they want, steal whatever it wants, and there's nothing stopping it. So that's one of the I think that's a major point I think I'd like to underscore. Like, when we talk about border patrols, we're always talking about one set of people, not another set of people.
Since colonial times, right?
Yeah, 500 years.
Yeah, 500.
In this
so these borders like this are definitely like a neo-colonial project, but they're just the latest manifestation of that kind of militarization that you've seen since colonial times.
Yeah. That's right.
Preventing people from moving around. In
fact, like, you think of how borders are formed, and it's totally a colonial process, right? The way that indigenous land, like the U.S. southern border, it's imposed upon like the Tohono people who have Tohono on the Mexican side and the U.S. side. It's a colonial project. And if for what we talk about decolonizing, right? Well, let's open up the border, right? The borders keep us segmented, and even our thoughts in certain kind of colonized ways, like thinking of countries that were all their shapes were made from colonial processes, and then you know, and then the asymmetry that we see today and how it plays out in the world really stems back to this kind of colonialism that is present whether we know it or not today.
I think that for me, you know, my biggest in reading both books, but the thing that just makes me want to cry, but at the same time make the hair stand up on the back of my neck, is that people are being physically prevented from fleeing natural disaster and or economic disaster and or, you know, war. And as you mentioned earlier, a lot of those things are caused by U.S. economic policy and foreign policy and military policy. And, you know, to not be able to flee a devastating hurricane, to not be able to move somewhere when your farm is no longer agritable. I mean, that's just, it's inhuman. I don't even know how to define it. I can't even imagine the things that you've seen. I know Leslie and I have traveled all over the Americas for most of our working lives. And I mean, I can't even imagine the things, Todd, that you have seen. You know, it's particularly, it's just awful. I don't even know. I don't even have the words for it. It's killing people in a way. I guess it's a form of murder, for lack of a better
I would
phrase.
argue, yeah, I would argue that you don't see, like, it's a new type of warfare in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's
It's how the wars are happening. The wars are happening less between countries, nation states, and more between a war of elite on the poor. And these wars happen often in these border zones, whether it be the Mexico-Guatemala border, Dominican Haiti border, Panamanian border with Colombia, you name it. And it happens in places that are just not seen. Like what you're talking about, this kind of blockading of people is not seen. It forces people out into these really desolate areas where the war becomes this, this confluence of different possible devastating things happening. Like the prevention through deterrence strategy on the US border forces people into the desert where they cannot carry enough water, like the Juan Carlos, the man I was talking about, that I met on the road.
And if you bring them water, you're arrested and put in jail, like Dr. Warren.
Right. The humanitarian aid efforts, though supposedly, to be clear, you're supposedly, according to the humanitarian, or according to the law, you can give people water. Though, as you just mentioned, that's been contested in the Scott Warren case. In other cases, like in Southern Arizona, people have put out water in like national parks and been arrested by park rangers for littering, like putting a full jug of water. So that they get around that sort of like those laws even to do that. Or there's been the documented cases of Border Patrol going and slicing water jugs put out or kicking them over the side of a mountain or something like that. So, but that's the whole thing, is that people are getting this. It's either these forces or having to go through these desolate areas. You could talk about the bestia or the beast going up through Mexico, the train. It's part of the same thing. Anything that puts people in vulnerable areas where they're put into dangerous situations is supposed to be a quote unquote deterrent. And that's all part of it. And I would argue that this is like one of the most modern warfare war zones. And what a border does is create a permanent one, right? There's no longer a beginning nor an ending. The border is the justification of it. Here's a border just because it exists. Oh, here's a border zone. And you can, like in the United States, they call it a constitution free zone some places, because the elements of the US Constitution at least become mangled in these areas where I guess a better way to say it is a state of exception, right? In these states of exception, you're allowed, like officials and official forces can do way more than they could do if it wasn't in those sorts of states. So it's like this low intensity, to use the low intensity doctrine, low intensity kind of war zone that you could see permeating in different borders wherever you go, whatever border. Like I've been to so many of them, and now they're all different, but they have all these kind of similarities of, I can arrest you, I can pull a gun on you if you cross this line, and that's a criminal act, and then that gives me a lot of power over you.
That's like when you are at the airport in the United States, and if you are coming through immigration and get pulled for secondary questioning and additional, you get put in a room by Border Patrol, and you're like in a constitutional void.
Yeah.
Even as a U.S. citizen with a valid passport, when you are put in one of those rooms for additional questions, it's a void. You're just in this void,
Yeah,
this
Mhm.
black
can-
zone.
whatever, like the Fourth Amendment, the right not to be searched nor seized,
Yeah.
gone. You might as well just
It's all of it.
burn
Yeah.
burn it all down because it's not there. I remember one time I crossed the border, and they made me and a friend of mine leave everything in the car, including our phones, and we went
Mhm.
into this room for secondary interrogation, and they shut the door and locked it. So we were actually detained as if in
You were like in a cell, a
in a
holding
cell.
cell, a
But
prison
they didn't
cell.
tell it. They didn't tell us that. They said, "Oh, just wait here while we look through your car." But they locked the door was locked, so it was like being cell, and they didn't even say anything because whatever it is, like you say, there's a void area, and the
Yeah.
border, actual border, and then it's not only the actual border; it's 100 miles, 100
Yeah.
miles inland, and that's one of the things that. So they checkpoints are put up in different, like all over the borderlands, roving patrols of Department of Homeland Security. They're everywhere. They can pull you over for a reasonable suspicion, which could be anything, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, and so
What
that's
is
sort
reasonable.
of yeah.
Mhm.
Not
So for
to
the
mention
audience,
that-
what Todd is talking about when he's talking about this 100-mile zone, it's from what is officially the U.S. border, one or even the coast of, say, like California, 100 miles in. So into the east in California, up from the north from the Mexico-U.S. border, and then Washington State, 100 miles down south from the Canadian border. That, I mean, that's where the Border Patrol works. 100 miles in the whole
And that's-
perimeter of the United States.
and if you look at the population of the United States, that's 200 million people, or 2/3
Wow.
of the U.S. lives in these zones.
Yeah.
And if
Well,
you
yeah,
look
New
at
York
how
City.
New York City's in it, and the Border Patrol has expanded. Like in the last 25 years, in 1994 it was 4,000. Now it's 21,000. Customs and Border Protection 60,000, and it's 60,000 agents, and it's the largest federal law enforcement agency. So what we were talking about when they deemed these zones, like in the 1950s, and to what it is now, like these forces now are more. They can expand in different places. That's why CBP could send drones over Minneapolis after George Floyd in 2020. CBP sent Predator B drones over to do surveillance over Minneapolis, or BORTAC, which is the Special Forces Unit of the U.S. Border Patrol, could go into Portland and swipe people off the streets, or go into Washington, D.C. and mark green uniform Border Patrol agents. All those places are in this 100-mile zone. I mean, it's still definitely concentrated more on the southern border for sure. But as it expands, it could just be deployed in more and more places.
This
So
is
Todd,
what we at Code Pink say is, and Leslie's organization too, we say, this is what you're talking about, Todd, is the example or is the reality of U.S. foreign and military policy coming home.
Yeah.
So Todd, has anything changed since President Biden took office? Because we knew what the former, I don't even want to say his name, did, but
the former White House occupant.
the former White House, right? What has actually changed since then regarding immigration?
The rhetoric has changed. In substance, the face of it. We're anti-wall, but it's being shown that they're still even building the wall. They say we're gonna not build one more foot of wall, but we're gonna divert to technology, as if technology is humane. It's not. We're talking about these invasive surveillance technologies that are given out these huge contracts to private companies that become a kind of the corporatization of the border and profit-making elements of it. You had this kind of winding down of the Remain in Mexico program that was happening and never fully happened, and now it looks like they're trying to implement it yet again. Title 42, which is the COVID era, the enforcement, how they're enforcing the border. Like with Title 42, if people cross the border, they can do rapid expulsions, including asylum seekers, so they could stop people from asking for asylum and just really deport them back to Mexico rapidly. Title 42, which is Trump era COVID-19, many people are saying that this should be rescinded now, is still in effect. And that's just the Trump stuff. I would the when you look at the Biden administration, and I always look before Trump because all the brutal border apparatus predated the Trump administration. The massive historic buildup of it. You can look into the 1990s with the Bill Clinton administration with operations such as Gatekeeper and Safeguard, and this just massive buildup of infrastructure that went on turbo drive after 9/11, and looking at these budgets growing and growing and growing and growing. By the time Trump took office, it was a $20 billion budget for CBP and ICE. It was more than all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. That includes like the DEA and the FBI and the U.S. Marshals. And all this emphasis has been putting on border and immigration enforcement. And there's no indication in that sense that Biden's is going to stop those bigger, broader trends of building up the border, of the prevention through deterrence policy and strategy that's been in effect since 1994, and the externalization of the border part of it. It seems to be an emphasis that's being undercovered by the media, but it seems to me, having covered it, that empire of borders aspect of it, there's a lot of emphasis on expanding it out further and fortifying areas in Mexico and Central America and going further and further down. And so to my eyes, as we proceed, now we're more than 6 months into we're like 10 months into it. We're in October. Oh my God.
Almost a year.
Almost a year. It seems to me that it's pretty much the MO, right? The status quo is winning. It's possible that there'll be enough pressure that they'll finally rescind Title 42, that there's pushback against them starting up the Remain in Mexico program again, and that seems to be what's happening. But it just seems like it's just a continuation of what has been happening. And that said, I just want to say one more thing about it. The Trump administration you could not pressure the Trump administration. The Biden administration seems like there is potential. The difference is there's potential, if there's some grassroots pressure, to pressure them about this. The rhetoric is pro-immigrant, anti-wall. They're saying all these things, but doing the opposite. So basically calling them out on that stuff, pressuring them. Maybe I don't know if it will, but could have some effect. Last thing is that they're getting so many campaign contributions from border industry companies, that sort of things going on as well, which of course, so you're up against a mountain, right? But
privatization.
Yeah, exactly.
And profiting off of migrants.
Yeah.
Who are fleeing, deadly things. I could just keep talking here. I want to bring in two people from our audience. I've got one comment and one question for you.
Sure.
So Rick Cohn says there are so many immigrants from Guatemala and Honduras compared to Nicaragua. Imagine if we allowed countries to help their own people thrive like the Nicaraguan government does. We wouldn't need the militarization to prevent immigration. And that's what we were talking about earlier, that clash between governments that are people over profit and other models that are profit only, pretty much. And then Stan Becker has a question for you, Todd. What would be a humane, ethical border and immigration policy short of open borders?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that the way a border is set up right now, the idea of a humane border is a bit of an oxymoron. But that said, it seems like there are very palpable things that could be done. For example, if you look at the CBP ICE budgets or the border militarization budgets, they just have grown and grown and grown and grown and grown over the last 25 years, even since the 1980s. What if they didn't grow? Like, what if we were able to stop them from growing? What if we could just bring them down some notches and then take that money and spend it on something else, like something
like Code Pink's Cut the Pentagon campaign,
like Code Pink's Cut the Pentagon campaign, like any like those sorts of more like that might be, instead of saying no borders or open borders in Washington, you could say, let's stop this increase of the budgets and put that money towards something else.
Like cleaning the
Or
environment. Clean
like
the
cleaning
environment.
yeah, like cleaning the environment, or there's so much that can be done. The climate finance is a very interesting one. And I should say I'm co-authoring a report for the Transnational Institute that's going to come out this coming
Oh,
week.
wow.
And it's
Oh, wow.
called
You'll have to send us the link to that.
I will. It's called the Great Climate Border. And it looks at the historic emitting countries and showing that there's a parallel between them and border militarizing. And then it's also showing that they've been neglecting the climate finance. And climate finance is the amount of money that the rich countries said they were going to put towards more low-income countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change, because to help them with adaptation and to withstand some of the impacts of climate change. But when you look at climate finance, and it has been woefully, it has been neglected. And at the same time, the border budgets of all these countries, and we looked at of course, the US, but also Canada, Germany, the UK, Australia. I think there's a couple others, Japan.
New Zealand, probably.
We didn't look at New Zealand. They didn't. I mean, we could look at New Zealand, but New Zealand wasn't in the. We looked at the top 10 historic emitters, and then looked at like, okay, they have this debt to the world, right? Being the historic emitters, and then we went from that kind of perspective. But it's a big report, and there's lots of visuals and stuff.
Well, you'll have to share that with us.
I will do. Yeah. And so one thing is like, why not spend it on climate finance, right? If there's so much displacement happening already due to climate change, and the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center is saying 25 million people per year at this point that they can calculate. There's probably more because their ability to calculate droughts is not as good as they want it to be. So if you could put more money into climate finance, and that mitigates, like, mitigates the people.
The migration.
People don't need. Yeah, people don't need, if things are good. A lot of people just don't want to migrate. They want to stay or in their places, and it's like, if there's more like, and it'd have to be, there's so much like USAID, and we know all about all that, right? All the kind of investment from the United States that sort of undermines people, and that's not what I don't think that's what we're talking about. It's more of this climate finance that goes to local regional movements and people to be able to develop to withstand it. And that's one thing. Like, why not do that instead of build more wall, right? It just makes so much more sense.
Yeah, and it's not ultimately what it's about for many people.
Right. I guess.
I'm so happy we've had this hour with you. Oh my gosh, I want to just keep talking to you. I want to have you come back, but I'm going to ask again, please be sure to share the link for your report, and we should probably take a look at it and then have you come back and talk about it.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And also my recommendation to those folks who are watching us is to invite Todd once this pandemic is, under control. We were very lucky here in Columbia, Maryland, to have him a couple of times at least. Yeah. And it's so much better to have you in person with a potluck dinner. We hope to do it next year. Todd.
I hope so. I really do.
Yes.
I really want to do that. So, yes.
And for our audience, Build Bridges Not Walls can be purchased at citylights.com. And anyone ordering from the citylights.com site gets an automatic 30% discount. And then, Todd, I believe Empire of Borders can be purchased at versobooks.com, VERSO books.com. For all of you watching. So I want to remind all of you, you've been watching What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, Code Pink's weekly YouTube program of hot news out of the region. We broadcast every Wednesday evening, 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, excuse me. I'm at the 7th. I'm the 2-hour difference. And also be sure to listen to Code Pink Radio every Thursday morning, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, broadcast out of New York City, WBAI New York City, simulcasting WPFW Washington, D.C. Both What the F is Going On in Latin America and Code Pink Radio can be found now on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and wherever you listen to your podcasts. So thank you, everyone, for joining us.
This program will be recorded, right? So for
Yes,
folks
this
who missed the
recording
program, please let them know.
Everyone can find it on Code Pink's YouTube channel. It's an evergreen link on Code Pink YouTube. And also you can find it, the audio will be available by Friday on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So,
Great.
and those of you who registered for the Zoom will get the link emailed to you. So multiple ways to listen to this fabulous conversation with Todd. And please be sure to read all his books. And as Leslie said, have him come speak to your community and your work. I really appreciate it, Todd. This was a fabulous conversation, and you do just incredible work. It's a real honor to meet you and talk with you. A real privilege. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was my privilege to be on your program and to be with you and Leslie and Code Pink and Friends of Latin America. So it's my honor to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Todd. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Good night.